I never told my son about the money, not because I was ashamed of it or because I thought he couldn't handle it. I just wanted, for once, to be loved for who I was, not for what I had. His name is Terrell. He's 43 years old, works in logistics, and has his father's jawline and, unfortunately, his father's habit of letting other people do his thinking for him. His wife, I'll call her what she is, my daughter-in-law. Her name is Vanessa. She's 38, sharp-tongued, and has a way of smiling at you that never quite reaches her eyes. They invited me to move in with them 2 years ago, right after I sold the house on Meadow Creek Drive. The house I'd lived in for 31 years, the house where I raised Terrell after his father left, where I'd painted the front porch railing 3 different colors before settling on that dusty sage green that I still think was the right choice. I sold it for $340,000. Not a bad number for a woman they thought was barely scraping by on a teacher's pension. What Terrell didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that I hadn't been a classroom teacher for the last 12 years of my career. I had moved into curriculum development and then into educational consulting. By the time I retired, I was billing $280 an hour. I had a portfolio of long-term contracts with 3 different school districts in 2 states. My monthly income when I finally stepped back at 68 was just over $39,000. I had investments. I had accounts. I had a financial advisor named Mr. Beaumont who wore bow ties and called me every quarter without fail. I told no one. Part of that was habit. I grew up in a house where you didn't discuss money, not at the table, not anywhere. My mother kept the family finances in a locked metal box under the bed and considered it nobody's business, including my father's. I inherited that privacy the way some people inherit eye color or stubbornness. And part of it, the bigger part, if I'm being honest with myself, was that I'd watched what money does to people. I'd watched it divide families, rewrite histories, turn children into creditors and parents into ATMs. I didn't want that. I just wanted Sunday dinners and someone to call when a storm knocked the power out. So when Terrell sat across from me at my kitchen table in March of that year and said, "Mom, we've got the space," and honestly, it would give us all peace of mind, I believed him. I truly did. I sold the house. I donated half the furniture to the church. I packed 6 boxes of things I couldn't part with. My grandmother's quilt, my first edition copy of Their Eyes, We're Watching God, the framed photograph of me at 32 standing in front of the Washington Monument looking like I owned the city, and I moved into the spare bedroom at the end of the hall in their house on Dunmore Street. The spare bedroom that Vanessa had converted, partially, into a craft room. She'd left the bed and the dresser, but kept 2 shelving units along one wall and her sewing table in the corner. She told me she'd move it eventually. That was 22 months ago. The sewing table is still there. The first few months were fine. Better than fine, actually. Terrell and I had breakfast together most mornings before he left for work. I cooked dinners on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I watched their younger daughter, Brianna, after school on the days Vanessa had her real estate classes. Brianna was 7, and she liked to tell me about her day in elaborate, non-linear detail that I found genuinely delightful. She would start a sentence about something that happened at recess and end it somewhere completely different. In a story about a caterpillar she'd seen at a birthday party the previous summer, and I would follow her there without question because that's what grandmothers are for. I paid rent. I insisted on that. $400 a month, which Terrell initially refused and then accepted when I told him I wouldn't stay otherwise. I paid for my own groceries. I filled the gas tank whenever I used Vanessa's car for Brianna's pickup. I tried to make myself small in the ways that mattered and present in the ways that didn't cost anyone anything. It was Vanessa who started to change first. Or maybe she didn't change. Maybe I just started seeing her more clearly. It began with small things. Comments about the bathroom I shared with Brianna. "She takes forever in there, and then it smells like that old powder you use," said to Terrell, not to me, but with the volume calibrated so I could hear it from the hallway. Then there were the dinner invitations I was quietly not included in. Friends of theirs would come over, and I'd hear the sounds, the laughter, the wine glasses, the back door closing as they moved out onto the patio, and I'd sit in my room with a book I wasn't reading, telling myself it was fine. They needed their own life. They were entitled to evenings that didn't include his mother. But then it became something else. Vanessa had a sister, Daphne, who visited for a long weekend in October. I made a point to stay out of their way, but the house was not large, and walls do not insulate well against a certain kind of conversation. I heard Daphne say, "How long is she staying?" I heard Vanessa say, "I keep asking Terrell to figure something out." I heard Daphne say, "Can't she go somewhere? Like a facility or something? She must qualify for something. A facility." I was 69 years old. I walked 2 miles every morning. I did the crossword in pen. I had a sharper mind than half the people I'd ever worked with, and I was being quietly discussed, like a problem that needed to be sorted into an appropriate bin. I lay in my bed that night and looked at the ceiling and thought about my mother. How she used to say that you find out who people are when they think no one is watching. I thought she was talking about strangers. I didn't know she was giving me a lesson I'd need this late in my life. I called Mr. Beaumont the next morning from my car in the grocery store parking lot. I asked him some questions. He answered them carefully, the way he always did, with precision and without judgment. I asked him to run some numbers. He said he'd have something for me by the end of the week. I drove home and made a pot of soup and didn't say a word to anyone. The morning everything broke open was a Wednesday in November. Terrell had left early, a distribution center in Columbus, a 7 a.m. call he'd mentioned the night before. Brianna was at school. It was just me and Vanessa in the house, which happened sometimes, and usually we moved around each other like two people in a library, polite and distant. I was at the kitchen table with my coffee and my crossword when she came in. She poured herself a cup without looking at me, and then she stood at the counter for a long moment with her back to me, and I had the distinct feeling she was working herself up to something. "I need to talk to you," she said. I put down my pen. She turned around. She wasn't unkind in her expression, exactly, or she was trying not to be. But there was something in it that reminded me of the way people look when they're about to say something they've decided is for your own good. "This isn't working," she said, "for any of us. I think you know that." I waited. Terrell doesn't want to be the one to say it, but honestly, I think it's time you looked at other options. There are some really lovely retirement communities, active ones, not nursing homes. I'm not saying that. And you'd have people your own age, activities, a community that's built for people like me, I said. She paused. "I didn't say that. You implied it." She set her mug down. "Look, I'm trying to be honest with you, which I think you'd appreciate. You're not contributing to this household in a meaningful way. Terrell works 12-hour days. I'm trying to build my business. We have a child to raise. And having another adult in the house, an adult who doesn't really have a role here, it creates a dynamic that isn't healthy for anyone." I looked at her for a moment. "Doesn't have a role," I repeated. "I don't mean it harshly. I pick up your daughter from school 3 days a week. We appreciate that, but we can figure something else out. I make dinner twice a week, which honestly is more of a disruption than a help at this point, because Brianna's eating habits are." She stopped, took a breath. "The point is, we think it's time. You have your pension, you have some savings from the house sale, and there are programs, subsidized places, where you'd be comfortable without being a..." She didn't finish that sentence, but we both knew what the last word was going to be. A burden. I picked up my pen. I looked back down at my crossword, 7 across, a hidden reserve, 8 letters. "I'll look into my options," I said. She seemed surprised, maybe expecting more resistance, more tears, more of whatever she'd braced herself for. She nodded, businesslike. "I think that's really mature of you." She picked up her coffee and walked out of the kitchen. I filled in 7 across, windfall. I did not call Terrell that day. I wanted him to come home and find me exactly as I always was, at the table with a book after dinner, asking Brianna about her day, loading the dishwasher without being asked. I wanted him to have nothing to read in me. He came home at 6:15. Vanessa had clearly not said anything yet, because he was relaxed, easy, asking me how my day was with the genuine warmth he'd always had for me when it was just the two of us. We ate the chicken I'd made. Brianna spilled her milk and nobody made a big deal of it. It was, in every surface way, a perfectly ordinary Wednesday evening. After Brianna was in bed, I heard them in their room. I wasn't trying to listen. But Terrell's voice carries always has us. He inherited that from me, and the walls on Dunmore Street are not thick. She said she'd look into it, Vanessa said. A pause. Look into what? Terrell said. Moving. Finding a place. I talked to her this morning. Another pause. Longer this time. You talked to her? Without me? You weren't going to do it. Because I don't think we should be pushing her out, Vanessa. She's my mother. She's also 69 years old, and she's been living in our craft room for 2 years. It's not a craft room. It still has my sewing table in it. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed, and I thought about what I was going to do. Not with anger. I was past anger by then. I think I had passed through it sometime in October without fully noticing, but with something cooler and more deliberate. I thought about what I owed them and what I didn't. I thought about Brianna, who had nothing to do with any of this and who had a way of resting her head against my shoulder when we watched cartoons on Saturday mornings that I did not want to lose. I thought about what Mr. Beaumont had told me. I thought about the house on Dunmore Street. Here is what Terrell did not know, and what Vanessa certainly did not know. I owned the house they were living in. Not in the way that sounds. I hadn't gone behind anyone's back. When Terrell and Vanessa had bought the house 6 years ago, they had been $47,000 short of the down payment. They'd come to me quietly, separately from each other, and then together, and I had written a check. At the time, we agreed, informally, which I now recognized was my mistake, that they would pay me back when they could, and that I had an ownership stake equal to the amount I'd contributed. We had never formalized this. There was no signed agreement. What there was, however, was a paper trail, bank record, a letter I'd written at the time, which Terrell had countersigned and which I had kept in the locked fireproof box under my bed, the same habit my mother had passed down to me. Bless her. Mr. Beaumont had connected me with a real estate attorney named Ms. Okafor, who was precise and unhurried, and who reviewed my documents and told me in her careful way that I had options. Not airtight ones. We'd have to pursue it. But options. I did not want to take their house. I want to be clear about that. That was never the goal. The goal was something smaller and more important. I wanted my son to see me. Not as a problem. Not as a duty or a liability or something to be sorted into a facility. I wanted him to understand that I had been choosing every single day to be present in his life with everything I had, and that I had more than any of them had imagined. What I decided to do was simpler than what the attorney had outlined. I decided to tell the truth. I asked Terrell to drive with me on a Saturday. I told him I wanted to look at a few retirement communities just to have the conversation, just to understand what was out there. He looked relieved and guilty at the same time, that particular combination that people get when someone else does the hard thing they were supposed to do. We drove out to a place in Westerville. It was genuinely lovely, landscaped, active, with a woodworking studio and a yoga class and a woman at the front desk who had the warmth of someone who'd been doing this work for a long time and meant it. Terrell walked through it with me with his hands in his pockets, looking at everything and saying very little. On the drive home, I told him. Not all at once. I started from the beginning. The consulting work, the transition out of the classroom that he'd sort of known about, but hadn't paid close attention to because he'd been 27 and newly married and absorbed in his own life, which is what people that age are supposed to be. I told him about the contracts, the clients, the financial advisor with the bow ties. I told him about the accounts. He drove. He didn't say anything for a long time. How much, he finally said. Monthly income from investments and residual consulting, about $39,000. He pulled into a gas station parking lot. He didn't need gas. He just needed to stop the car. Mom, I know. Why didn't you ever? Because I didn't want you to love me for that, I said. I wanted you to love me for me. And for a long time you did, and that was enough. He put his hands over his face. He sat like that for a minute. I waited. I had time. The down payment, he said, the $47,000. Yes, we were going to pay you back. I know you were. We never. He stopped. Vanessa kept saying we should wait until the business was more stable, and then there was the car, and then Terrell. I waited until he looked at me. I'm not here to collect a debt. I want you to understand that. I came to live with you because you asked me, and because I love you, and because I thought it would be good for all of us. And some of it was. Brianna. Those Saturday mornings with Brianna are some of the best I've had in years. He looked like he might cry. He was his father's son in the jawline, but he was mine in everything that mattered. What do you want me to do? He said. It wasn't defensive. It was genuine. The genuine question of a man who had just understood, for the first time, how little he'd been paying attention. I want you to talk to your wife, I said. Not about money. About what kind of family we're going to be. About what it means when you ask someone to be part of your home, and then you decide they don't have a role in it. He nodded slowly. And then, I said, I want you to come to a decision that you and I make together, not one that gets made while I'm at the kitchen table with my crossword and someone else is deciding what I'm worth. He looked at me. She told you that, the thing about not contributing in a meaningful way. Word for word, I said. He closed his eyes. Vanessa and I did not have a warm conversation. I want to be honest about that because I've heard too many stories that wrap up with the daughter-in-law weeping and saying she never really understood, and everyone going in for a group hug, and that is not what happened in the Meridian Bakery parking lot on Dunmore Street on a Saturday in December. What happened was that Terrell sat across from her at the kitchen table, and I sat at the end, and he told her the truth about the down payment and the ownership stake and the money I'd never mentioned. I watched her face go through several things in quick succession: disbelief, calculation, something that might have been embarrassment if she'd let it stay long enough. So what does this mean? She said. She was looking at Terrell, not me. It means we owe my mother a conversation we should have had a long time ago, he said. She was quiet. It means, I said, and she looked at me, that I am not a woman who needs to be placed somewhere. I am not a burden. I am not someone without a role. And going forward, I'd like to be spoken to like the adult I am, by both of you, about decisions that involve me. She looked at the table. I didn't mean for it to come out the way it did. How did you mean for it to come out? She didn't answer that. What she did, eventually, and I'll give her this, was look up at me and say, I think I've handled this badly. Not I'm sorry, not I was wrong. But she was not someone who had been raised to admit fault easily, and I've handled this badly was more than I'd expected. I told her I wasn't interested in revisiting every wound. I told her I was interested in what came next. What came next was this. I moved out of the room on Dunmore Street. Not because they asked me to, but because I chose to. I had more than enough to make that choice comfortably, and I wanted the choice to be mine. I found a 2-bedroom apartment 20 minutes away with a south-facing window and a small balcony where I keep a pot of rosemary and one of lavender and one stubborn jade plant that has survived 11 moves and shows no signs of quitting. I have Brianna every other Saturday. I drive to get her myself, and we go wherever she wants. The library, the farmer's market, once the science museum where she stood in front of the butterfly enclosure for 45 minutes, and I stood beside her and thought I could do this forever. I make dinner on those evenings and I drive her home, and Terrell walks her in and then comes back to the door and says goodnight to me, and there is a warmth there that had gone thin and is slowly coming back. Vanessa and I are not close. We are not enemies. We are two women who were honest with each other, one sooner than the other, and we are finding our way through the aftermath of that honesty with as much grace as we can manage. Last month, she texted me to ask which moisturizer I used because my skin, she said, looked remarkable for my age. I texted her back the name of the brand. I didn't say anything else. But I thought, standing in my kitchen in my apartment with the rosemary on the balcony and the lavender and the unkillable jade. That's a start. That's enough of a start.